The fall of the USSR happened on December 26 of 1991 in the Soviet Union, now modern-day Russia. This fall signaled a real end to the significant Cold War era of history. During the Cold War, a bipolar world was established along the lines of the capitalist West and the communist and socialist East. These two sides were headed by the USA and the USSR respectively. This fall came as a result of a crumbling Soviet economy and ideology, increasing Western pressure, and an internal movement for democracy. So, the competing Cold War ideologies of the USA and the USSR, along with globalization, led to the fall of the USSR because these factors led to a broken Soviet economy and ideology. Along with this, the spread of democracy and Western ideologies helped to assist the fall. After the bipolar world was established and the Cold War began, the stage was set for the fall of the USSR. One of the first factors that led to the fall of the USSR was the rule of Mikhail Gorbachev. Gorbachev's rules started with a fundamentally damaged and fractured economy that was falling apart. This factor already put a fair amount of strain on him. He furthered the fall of the USSR by putting in place several policies that undermined the Soviet ideology. In particular, policies like perestroika opened up the Soviet market and made it more free, which undermined the idea of Soviet communism. However, Gorbachev's rule was not the only thing that led to the fall of the USSR. For example, the Soviet Union also fell because many of their republics, like Ukraine, Georgia, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Moldova, Turkmenistan, Tajikistan, and Uzbekistan, declared independence from the USSR. These declarations of independence greatly hurt both the power and the stability of the USSR. The power of the Soviet Union began to wane as they saw their sphere of influence shrink as a result of their territory loss. These nations decided to leave because they no longer believed in the crumbling Soviet ideology. Lastly, as the Soviets expanded their reach, they came in contact with the Western powers of the world, and in particular, the USA. Presidents like Ronald Reagan supplied a steady and slow increasing stream of pressure on the Soviets until they were eventually pushed to the point of surrender in this ideological war. One major ideological loss that the Soviets suffered was the fall of the Berlin Wall, which in its destruction lowered the power of the Soviet Union on an ideological level. The fall of the Berlin Wall connects back to Gorbachev because he openly cooperated with the USA and made it possible for the wall to come down. Looking into the specifics of the event, the fall of the USSR occurred in December of 1991 in the USSR after the Soviets faced a series of defeats at the hands of the West, and the Soviet ideology began to crumble and cave in. As the West pressured the USSR and they lost their global influence, the USSR began to collapse in on itself. When the USSR fell, many things could have happened at the time. For example, Russia could have easily gone into a civil war for control over the country. However, thanks to people like Boris Yeltsin, a new democratic Russian government was in place prior to the fall. This new government set the stage for the creation of the modern-day Russian Federation. The fall of the USSR can be considered historically significant because it marked the end of the ideological Cold War between the capitalist West and the communist East. It also led to capitalism becoming the predominant ideology in the West and even the majority of the world. After this, capitalism prevailed over socialism and communism. This event connects to bipolarity because the USSR was the opposing side to the USA in the Cold War, an event caused by two clashing ideologies. However, this event also connects to late capitalism because as Western capitalism began to win out over communism, the USSR began to lose territories and power to the now widespread capitalist ideology. The fall of the USSR is connected to globalization because the fall was a result of spreading capitalism. However, it is also connected to globalization because the citizens of the USSR were very isolated from the rest of the world, so as the Soviet Union fell, new ideas and cultures were able to enter Russia. In conclusion, the fall of the USSR happened when the West pressured the USSR and the USSR lost its influence in Europe. This fall marked the end of the bipolar world that had been established as a result of the Cold War. However, it also connects to late capitalism because when the USSR fell, so did the power of the Soviet ideology, therefore leading way to the predominance of capitalism in the world. It also connects to globalization because the once isolated citizens of the USSR were now open to connect to the capitalist world. The fall also influenced the US's modern relation to Russia because the newly democratic Russian government would give way to the formation of the modern Russian Federation.
Союз первый Fine, I'll do it myself.